Welcome back to another in our video series for the good, the bad, and the uncanny, exploring the Older Testament. Margaret and I are really happy to welcome Thea Portier-Young to join us. Hi, Thea. Thea is Associate Professor of Old Testament at Duke Divinity School and Duke University, Durham, North Carolina, and also knows a lot about Daniel and knows a lot about apocalyptic literature, which we'll dig into certainly more on the Sunday when we present on Daniel. But maybe we should just start with that. Like, what kind of book is this? Yeah, when we get to Daniel, because anybody who reads it obviously knows it's two really different kinds, or feels like two different kinds of books, even when you read it in English, when you when you turn the page to chapter 7, right? So like, just kind of walk us through what this is.
Okay, yeah. So if you're reading Daniel in a typical Bible, it will be presented usually with 12 chapters. In a Catholic Bible, it's going to be presented in a slightly different version that's got what are called the additions to Daniel in most Protestant Bibles. But let's talk about that version that you're probably going to find in your Bible with 12 chapters. And the first 6 chapters feel like legends. They are these riveting tales of distress and jeopardy and contest. Some scholars have looked at them as folk tales that have collected around this very inspiring figure of Daniel and his 3 friends. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are their Babylonian names. Hananiah, Azariah, Mishael are their Hebrew names. So that's the first half of the book, right? And there's a kind of coherence to that. These stories all seem to share some common themes. And then, as you said, we flip the page to chapter 7, and Daniel's having this vision, this dream vision that's very upsetting to him. And he's seeing this sequence of beasts that are, fantastical monsters, and they're like smashing the world, and then one of them's getting burned in a fire. Everything's changed. And what follows in the next, in the remainder of the book, those 6 chapters, are what we as scholars would call apocalyptic visions and apocalyptic discourses. It feels like a whole new genre. And in fact, we could call it a whole new genre. We could say that the book of Daniel as a whole instantiates this genre that's new to us in the biblical canon at this moment in time, and that would be apocalypse. And we can talk about how those stories and those visions function together to create that distinctive genre.
Yeah. It's the legends are all set in the time of Babylonian exile. They're all apparently these, I guess it'd be fair to call them Hebrews or Judahite young men who have these Babylonian names, and there's Babylonian king. But it also is a book that appears to have been written much later. And again, we'll talk about this on Sunday. Do you want to say something about the time in which we think it was probably either written or pulled together?
Absolutely. So this book, as you guys have been studying the various books of the Old Testament, you've probably run into an issue over and over, which is that we have trouble dating a lot of our biblical texts, especially Old Testament texts. But with the book of Daniel, we think we can narrow it down to sort of a 5-year period. We'll say between like 167 and 165 or 164 BCE is when most scholars think that the book of Daniel in that 12 chapter form that you've probably got in your Bible took shape, was kind of the final version was written. And so what was going on in that period of time that allows us to pinpoint this date? At this time, Jews living in Judea with their capital in Jerusalem were subjects of an ancient Hellenistic empire called the Seleucid Empire. And the Seleucids had their capitals in Mesopotamia and in some other parts of West Asia. And for a few decades, they had a kind of let's say a working relationship where it wasn't great to be subordinated to this foreign empire, but it was livable. And then things changed. A new king came to the throne, took the throne, Antiochus IV Epiphanes. He is one of the greatest of the great historical villains in ancient Judean and Jewish history. So Antiochus IV Epiphanes ascends to power. And in order to solidify and consolidate his rule, he goes about reconquering some of his territories. And that reconquest gives him an opportunity to plunder, to extract more resources, to exercise a heavier hand, if you will, in these various provinces. And in the province of Judea, part of what that entailed was a religious persecution. This is our first religious persecution on record historically within ancient Judaism. And it was truly devastating, beyond imagining, that if you chose to be faithful to the commands of God, that would spell death in these circumstances. And those are the conditions in which this book took shape, in which this new genre of historical apocalypse emerges. And that's the moment that the book of Daniel is speaking into.
So how does it do that? And actually, how do both of the sections of Daniel do that? Sort of what's the relationship of those early court scenes to this question of religious persecution? And then what's the relationship of apocalypse and empire?
Yeah, those are great questions. So maybe let's start with the first half of that, how each section of the book speaks into this moment and how they work together in that. So Matt mentioned earlier the context for those stories. They're all set in a foreign court in Babylonia, beginning in Babylon. And as you move through the stories, there's a shift where Babylon is conquered and the Persian Empire takes power, right? But the consistent theme that we see through each of the stories and those final visions is that power structure, right? And this goes to the second half of your question, that power structure of imperial rule. And what does it look like to navigate the choices you have to make as a believing and practicing Jew or worshiper of this God in that setting of imperial domination? And in those early chapters, I mentioned we have a theme of jeopardy that recurs. And I think folks will be most familiar with the stories of where jeopardy is greatest, getting thrown into the fiery furnace in chapter 3, and Daniel getting thrown into the lion's den in chapter 6. And in each case, they experience that jeopardy because they refuse to repudiate their faith. Right? In chapter 3, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refuse to bow down to Nebuchadnezzar's statue. They're not going to worship his idol. And they say something really powerful in that story. He's challenging them. Who's the God that can deliver you out of my hand? And they say, well, if our God chooses to save us, fantastic. We know that our God is able to save us. And if our God chooses to save us, great. And even if God does not, we are not going to bow down to your idol. In chapter 6, the jeopardy results from Daniel's practice of prayer 3 times a day. And it's visible. People can see him doing this in the upper room of his dwelling. And it creates an opportunity similar to the situation in the 2nd century. It creates an opportunity because he cares about this. This is how they can get him, right? He's a political rival, and this is an opportunity to attack him. And he is a law is established that he must cease praying, and if he does not, he will be thrown into the lion's den. And of course, as folks know, he continues to pray, he gets thrown in the den. And you can hear the analogy. Those stories we think were already circulating prior to the 2nd century. But you can hear how in this moment of religious persecution, in this moment of unprecedented crisis, the example of Daniel and the example of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego would speak so powerfully into a situation where you had to choose. Do you continue to observe Torah and risk your life, or do you repudiate the practices of your faith and save your life? And those stories said, you hold fast.
Mhm.
Be willing to hold fast to the covenant. It's worth that risk. So in that new moment, we have creative writers and teachers who recognize in these stories a source of hope, a model of courage, and also wanted to offer their audiences a new way of interpreting what was happening, a new way of seeing. And so when we come to the apocalyptic material, and let's think for a minute about what is an apocalypse? The most important thing we could say is an apocalypse is a genre that furnishes its audience a new way of seeing what's happening right now in the world, a way of seeing the hidden work of God, a way of seeing things as they really are. And so these visions were disclosing, revealing to their audiences. And that's what apocalypse means. It means revealing, pulling away the veil, revealing to their audiences the true nature of things in this moment. This imperial oppressor was, in fact, a monstrous violation of God's created order. This power structure was in violation of what God had ordained, and they would ultimately not be successful. So the writers of the apocalyptic visions combined those stories with the message to hold fast to the faith no matter what, with a vision of what was really happening, what God was actually doing, and with that, a message of hope for how God would continue to act and how God would intervene in those circumstances. I haven't said much yet about the power dynamics and how Daniel speaks about empire itself, but that was a long exposition. So I just wanted to pause there.
That's really helpful. One of the things we've been trying to track is the way in which we see change in the theologies, in some ways through time and through different parts of the Hebrew Bible, of our Old Testament. So you named some changes there. There's a change in that apocalyptic is relatively new, although some of this sounds a bit like Ezekiel. And I mean, there's a change from the prophets of the time around the destructions of the two kingdoms to now. Maybe we can talk about that. But there's also this promise of a life after death in Daniel chapter 12 too. So can you say a little bit more about some of the changes that we're seeing as whoever's behind this book writes this down and is deploying new ways of encouraging faith among people?
Yeah. So you named a lot of changes, and one of the things that I think would be most helpful to just name with regard to that is that when we look at the prophetic literature, one of the things, and I'm sure this is something that you have emphasized in this series, but one of the things that is really important to recognize is that prophets are speaking into their present context, right? And so when we see differences in the focus and the emphasis, and even in the way the genre is presented across different books in the Old Testament, we want to recognize that has so much to do with the historical context and what the people are experiencing, what the issues are that the prophet is speaking into. And so you mentioned let me see if I can track some of the multiple things that you mentioned, try to hold them together. You mentioned the oh, I kind of lost the thread. Let's talk about resurrection.
Sure, sure.
So in chapter 12 of Daniel, there is an entirely new theological idea. And folks might be surprised by that when I say an entirely new theological idea. But this is the first place in the scriptures, historically speaking, where we encounter the idea that after death, people will rise up for an experience of judgment, perhaps, and an experience of reward. This idea of a meaningful life after death is a new idea. So where does that come from? How is that different from what we saw before? And why is it here in Daniel? And of course, Christians know that this is going to be enormously important in the development of Christian faith. And so its appearance here in Daniel is really important. So prior to the composition of the book of Daniel, there is an idea that after death, there is a continued existence. In the Old Testament, usually the place is called Sheol. It somewhat corresponds to what we would call hell, not quite. Sheol is this kind of shadow land, and existence there is it's just sort of not bad. Not good. In the Psalms, we hear folks say, God, you should deliver me from my current trouble, because no one praises you from Sheol. So if you die, there's not really much going on in terms of a relationship with God. Saul calls Samuel up from Sheol, and he's there. He's able to talk to him in that moment, but we get the sense that he's just supposed to kind of go back to sleep and not much should be happening. So very different is what we hear in Daniel chapter 12, that the souls of, or some of those who sleep in the dust, right? It's a way of talking about death. Some of those who sleep in the dust will rise. Some will rise to shine like stars forever. And those who will rise to shine like stars are those who have led many to righteousness. And we'll talk about what that means in the context of Daniel. And some will rise to eternal condemnation. That's related to our idea of eternal damnation, eternal shame. So two groups that are going to rise from the dust. Now, in Daniel, it's not everyone. And what seems to be the case is that in this moment where people were dying precisely because they chose to be faithful, and people were getting to keep living precisely because they repudiated their faith, that seemed to be an upside down set of outcomes. If you go back to the book of Deuteronomy, for example, you have the blessings and the curses associated with covenant faithfulness. And if you are faithful, you will be blessed with long life. And if you are unfaithful to the covenant, you will be cut down, right? So in that Deuteronomistic theology, we should see in this lifetime the fruits of our choices. And at this moment, in this unprecedented religious persecution, it was the opposite. And so the promise that some would have the opportunity to experience their reward after death, and some would experience their consequences for unfaithfulness after death, was a theological writing of the balances in this unprecedented moment. And so again, we're going to see that new theology of resurrection becoming crucially important, especially within Christianity. Now, I mentioned I was going to say a little bit about what does it mean to rise to shine like the stars, and what does it mean that this will be the reward for those who have led many to righteousness. So Daniel has a theology of martyrdom, in fact, where for some during this time of crisis, to the calling to teach publicly and to witness to the future deliverance that God has planned and God will bring, will mean that they are making themselves vulnerable to death, that they are, in effect, kind of in the public square, broadcasting a message that is in every way counter to the empire's message, and in that work of witnessing, making it possible for others to find the courage to hold fast to their faith, right? And so that's what it means in that context, to lead the many to righteousness. It's a public testimony, a public witnessing that risks martyrdom. And for those who chose that path, their reward will be to shine like stars, which means, in effect, to become like the angels, and also in that shining to continue to be a witness.
This is interesting. We just did in Ezekiel the Valley of Dry Bones, right? And sort of talked about how that's often understood by Christians to be a resurrection, a sort of proof text in the Older Testament, but really in its context is sort of about God doing a new thing and returning the people to the land. But Daniel feels different. This feels like a sort of a step toward a resurrection from the dead, in a way that sort of leads toward, and here I am using sort of this teleological language, perhaps inappropriately, but that's sort of, there's more similarity to a sort of Christian understanding of a resurrection there than there was in Ezekiel. Is that, have I butchered that? Is that
yes, and
for my own question. Yeah.
Yes. So you're absolutely right to make that distinction, and another way we could perceive that distinction is a focus on the people as a whole in Ezekiel 37, right? That this is about the future of this people, that God has the power to reconstitute this people. And okay, so we can see that distinction, where in Daniel we see differentiation, right? Those who were faithful, those who were not faithful. And we could say that later ideas of resurrection in both Jewish and Christian tradition brought these passages together. And so in some streams of tradition, for example, the linking of ideas of resurrection, particularly to ideas about the body,
right, finds
particular precedent in Ezekiel 37, right? And in effect, we could say what they share is this assertion and conviction that God has the power to bring life. And let me also say, we have passages in the historical books, in the stories of Elijah and Elisha, where a prophet is able to bring back to life an individual who has died. And those stories are also important precursors. And I think it's fair to say that without thinking teleologically, but they are important precursors for Christian understandings of resurrection as well. And they are also important models, and I think self-consciously models for the miracles performed by Jesus.
So maybe the better question is sort of how are later traditions using these texts or finding in these texts the sort of the theological themes that they're looking for in their current contexts.
Using and finding, and we could also say how these texts are speaking into new moments, right, at a later time.
Absolutely.
What should we do with Daniel? Like in my experience, churches will teach some of the earlier stories to Sunday school children as these models of faithfulness and God's deliverance. And we ignore pretty much the second half of Daniel, except when we need it to help understand the Gospels, for example. But in other words, what's useful about this apocalyptic point of view beyond the historical understanding of how people navigated life in the Seleucid world, how Jews did, especially people, I think, like the three of us who don't face, at least I don't face persecution for my faith and expect I never will. But I know there are people who do in this world. And in other words, how do we just not dismiss the apocalyptic stuff as kind of weird, kind of funny, but best left alone for its time?
Yeah, great question. So, and let's acknowledge like why people do that. So the stories are really easy to read, and there's a reason that they appear in children's Bibles as perennial favorites or Veggie Tales, right? They're cognitively much easier to take on board. These apocalyptic visions and discourses are, in fact, really hard to follow. They, the king of the north and the king of the south, and who are we even talking about? How do we keep them straight? What's happening? And to some extent, they, in using this kind of coded language, to some extent, there's an intentional obfuscation, right? So that's one thing we're dealing with. And then on the other hand, there's a history of reading these apocalyptic texts, like trying to put the pin on the map in terms of, oh, this is referring to this country and this cataclysm that just happened, like, this natural disaster and this conflict, right? And we're trying to calculate when is the end going to come, and what are we looking out for? And we see that with Revelation as well. So that happens so many times, and you kind of see like, I don't think that's working. Yeah. It feels misguided. So okay, so these are the reasons that they tend to get pushed off, handled from a distance. And so I love this question to say, well, for us in our settings, how can it speak to us if we can push past some of that hesitancy? Remember what I said about helping us to see in a new way. And so one of the things I think we can take from these chapters of Daniel is a willingness to see the power structures within our own society in a way that gets beyond some of the surface of the story and looks at the real social consequences and looks at that from a theological point of view. And from there, allowing the book to make some demands of us to give witness when it might be uncomfortable. And that may sound like a little bit of a watering down of that, putting your life on the line, but there's a spectrum. And I think it is fair to say that the book offers a model as well as makes a certain demand on its audiences to do the work of giving hope, giving encouragement, and naming the powers for what they are. Even if that might mean incurring a certain social cost.
Got time for one more quick question, Margaret. Do you want it?
Yeah. Gosh, I love where you just went with that, with the use of apocalyptic and ways we might see it without dismissing it. I guess my last question would be, who is God in this book? What is the vision of who God is that Daniel offers?
Yeah, so Daniel's vision of God is first and foremost of a cosmic sovereign. And this is articulated in the book, I would say, first most clearly in chapter 2. There's a prayer that Daniel prays. And God is the one who establishes times and seasons. God is the one who puts kings on thrones and takes kings off of thrones, who reveals knowledge and brings hidden things to light and holds certain things hidden. And so there is throughout the book this understanding that God has sovereignty over all of history, over every ruler, whether they acknowledge it or not, right? And that is a dynamic that recurs over and over throughout the book, where typically rulers who, especially rulers who are not Israelite or Judean, will not immediately recognize that this God is sovereign in relation to their own, their own rule, and that their rule is contingent. And so over and over, you see kind of the education of kings in the stories who are learning about God's sovereignty, learning that God is the one who provides sustenance for all of creation. God is the one who has established their rule and their right to rule, and God has the power to take that away. When we come into those later chapters, we're going to see a king who doesn't acknowledge that and doesn't want to be taught that, and so challenges God's sovereignty. And in that context, another aspect of who God is really comes to the fore, and that is God is deliverer. God is the one who is faithful to those God has covenanted with, and God is the one who wills salvation for God's people.
Pia, this is so helpful. Thank you so much. This is just a great gift to our congregation. Thanks for your time and your wisdom.
I really enjoyed talking with you guys, and hey to everyone at Westminster, and thank you for your time today.